didn't bother taking a picture of my food. Yeah. That's a whole classification. Hey.
All right, was there a complaint about the slides from the gallery? The acronym for the working group, or the short name, has a BIS in it. The name of the working group is officially the HTTP working group. Right. And that's because after we finished BIS, I asked the area director at the time, who was also the current area director, but yeah, there's been stuff between, if we could change the name, and he said, no, it's too much trouble. So we changed the name, but not the acronym.
Hello, welcome to Monday, session 1 of Httpbis, or the HTTP working group if you prefer. We have a pretty full agenda today, mostly made up of talking about our active and adopted drafts, including a couple that are new on our plate since the last time we met. Okay, and we're just about ready to go. We're also going to talk about prioritization a little later on. So we'll have a chance to do agenda bashing when Mark puts up the agenda slide. And the blue sheets have been started to be passed around already, which is great. We've also established the scribes and minute takers, so thank you for your volunteerism to the IETF. Up on the screen now is the note well. The note well governs your contributions to the IETF and the intellectual property thereon. If you have questions about the note well, come chat with us, or even better, RAD. Next slide. not gonna say more. Let's see, check, check, and check. Thank you again, everyone. And here is our agenda, and you can see the list of active extensive drafts on the official agenda. Would anyone like to make changes thereupon? Going once, going twice, sold. All right, so we'll kick it off. The first draft we're going to talk about has been actually adopted since the last time we met together. And I believe Lucas is going to do the update and presentation on it. Thanks, Lucas. 3 minutes ahead already.
Rocking.
Hello. So as Patrick said, this was recently adopted. Thank you everyone for your implicit support. What is this thing? This is called Resource Digests, but it's about refreshing a nigh on 20-year-old RFC, which is 3230. So we've gone to the next slide. As you see, this is 2002. Done by Mogul, and it tried to fix a problem at the time, and the draft goes into a lot of discussive text about what that problem was. It received an update in 2010 by that RFC to just add algorithms. So on the next slide or two, I'll explain this, but not going there yet. It had this terminology around instances and entities, and I don't want to get into that. If you care, go and read it, or read the update, because it makes it a lot clearer, because it doesn't actually need to define it, because in the meantime, Httpbis has updated things to clarify. And the problem is that now those terms have inconsistencies with text that people are more familiar with using and are building upon today to build new capabilities and functionality. And so when they come to maybe try to use this digest header, it can be confusing and problematic. And so Roberto Polly and I have been trying to basically cut away the chaff, get down to the core of what this thing is, because in practice it's actually quite simple, and there's a few edge cases that don't jump out, so we try to improve upon them. In simple terms, the digest is just a hash over a representation or payload body. So if you go on to the next slide. As an example, you'd make a request for a thing, get a response back, and in this case it's hello world. We have a SHA-256 hash of that body. So the digest header header field is composed of the algorithm that you're using to calculate the hash, and then the hash itself. The format of that hash can vary. It could be base64 or some other thing. That definition is basically tied to the algorithm name and title. And so the list of algorithms held in IANA is what's listed on the right-hand side there. And if you go on to the next slide, I'll come on to that in a second. But what's the new digest thing? It's minimal, as I said, trying to use the same semantics as RFC 7230 terminology. Rather than entity and this weird thing, we use representation. Rather than instance, we use selected representation data. I don't really want to get into that, what those things mean, but maybe if people need clarifying at the end, we can do that. But those edge cases I mentioned around when you're doing different range requests or content encodings, if I return something, I don't know, hash, is the hash over the identity encoding, or is it these, the Brotli that I've used for that transfer? Some of the things that have happened in the meantime in the 20 years of security considerations for things around signatures. So digest is used quite often to protect the payload of a response, and signature head is used to protect the metadata. And the digest is the metadata or included in it. And so you can create a better value proposition by doing those things, but there's considerations. So we're going to the next one. Algorithms, the security landscape's changed in the last 20 years. So things that were defined in that header, like SHA-1 and MD5 are now not recommended. And like we said, we added these things called identity or content encoding independent algorithms. So it can be a bit confusing sometimes if you get a digest back to understand exactly which content encoding was used to create it. And the draft goes into more detail about those. Again, it's quite simple. Yes, next slide, please. There's a bunch of open issues that need input if anyone cares to add anything. They're presented here in order of kind of divisiveness. They're not urgent, but some of them are harder to debate than others. And you can see if you look at the bottom, do we need a threat model? Maybe. The bottom one for citing SHA is difficult to say. But really, as I mentioned, top-down use with HTTP signatures. Do we want to get into how to use this thing? Personally, I'd like to focus on making the message clearer for what this header is, and that any guidance on how to use it should probably live elsewhere, but I'd really like opinion on that. How to use this thing with patch requests, for instance, filling weird gaps that exist in the current document in the right way. So if anyone cares, please go on to GitHub. I don't think we need to go through them one by one now, just for time's sake. Next slide. This is Roberto's. So yeah, he wants to call us the axe shavers. Thanks, Roberto. But yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for adopting this document. And I hope that it's something that's straightforward to get done and that can improve the ecosystem. And
we do have time to, if you want to address a couple of those issues from the floor, if you have particular things they want to bring up, that's fine. Or gentlemen.
Martin Thompson. I like this. I like the fact that someone's finally doing this. Few minor comments I'll probably raise as issues. We already have a hash functions registry elsewhere in IANA, and I'd rather not make another one. You talked a little bit about how this interacts with content codings. Have you resolved that one?
More or less. I think the question might be, is the new identity digest algorithm value of use to people?
I suspect it is.
Yeah.
At least that's what I've heard anyway.
So one comment has been, how much does this add that's new? And my response would be, it doesn't add anything new. New algorithms help clarify the usage of this header.
Yeah, so the other thing to think about here is the relationship with SRI, and getting that clarified would be kind of interesting. I don't know whether it's our responsibility or someone else's, but it's worth thinking about. I don't know whether you want me to open an issue on that one or not. Yeah,
I don't know I'm not aware of any existing problem statement to that. So if there is one, or you have one you can build, I would appreciate that.
The question that I would ask there is, if I have an SRI on a link and I follow that link and I also get a digest header field on that response, would I expect the SHA-256 value to be the same on the SRI and the digest header field? And if you can say yes, that would be really nice. And if you could say as much, that would be even nicer.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to recognize Roberto because I have a feeling he wants to respond to that. So sorry, not this.
I know.
Sorry? I hit the red button. No. Okay, well, we'll figure that out. Roberto, in the room?
Roberto Payon. Good to have another Roberto around, by the way. Hello. Question. We've talked about binary or structured headers in the past, and this intersects here because the header name and how it is encoded are the same. If we are talking about actual having binary representations where you don't have to worry about an encoding of the hash itself, it would make a lot of sense to make sure that the hash name there is well known. I'm sure you can call it binary or something like that, but it's interesting to think about the case where there is no encoding because it's just the raw bits.
Okay, yep, thank you.
I was going to suggest that sorry, this is Jeffrey Yaskin. I was going to suggest that the SRI question should probably live in the W3C as a way of using the header that is defined here.
Yeah.
And Roberto, you might just have to be channeled through Jabber.
From Roy Fielding on Jabber. +1 to draft IETF Httpbis digest headers 00, but it might be nice to have a little more discussion in the draft about why the authors think these fields will be useful in the future.
Which field exactly? The digest header field itself, or is Roy asking for use cases, or both?
Martin?
None, Tom, so we'll let Roy respond in time. Oh, look at this, we have Roy in line. So how about we do the line thing and then I'll open a new topic.
Can someone in Jabber tell MeetEcho that our red button is broken and we're sad?
Oh no. Shall I continue then? Okay.
I don't know what that maps to.
Someone has already done that. The MeetEcho gods have been summoned. One of the questions that I had, and this relates to a similar sort of discussion we had about content coding a little while ago, is what are the principles that we use to drive the process of defining new digest schemes? Obviously, there's a couple in here, some of them quite simple, but we have some schemes that are increasingly complex. And some of them are parameterized in interesting ways. And it's not clear from the current system how we're supposed to encode that sort of information. So, for instance, if you look at the proposal that Jeffrey and I have been working on for sort of a progressive digest system, it's the mice draft. There are parameters that dictate the size of the blocks that are used. Mm-hmm. And those parameters dictate the how the value is calculated. So therefore you need to know them when you calculate the value. And so there's a really interesting relationship between the content coding, which at the moment also includes those values, and the digests themselves. And there's a discussion on one of the issues that I thought might be worth discussing here.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone have opinions on that one? My opinion would be a single block of octets for the value of any single digest, but that's my initial put.
What you were saying makes me think that we need to think about that more carefully, because it's not only content encoding, you have identity ones, for example, but also we have things like partial content versus full content and other dimensions, and how is that going to stack up?
So that's slightly different to what I was talking about. And yes, I agree, we need to talk about that one as well.
But you're talking about your progressive, yeah.
This is talking about the progressive one. And to provide context there, there's a block size at the start of the stream that then determines where the progressive hashes appear interleaved into the stream. And you need to know that block size in order to render the content. And I think it was Roberto who mentioned that, and not this Roberto, the other Roberto, who mentioned that when you remove that content coding and just save the file to a disk, you might still want to be able to go back and take that hash and prove that it still applies, but you just lost the meta information that was encoded into that string.
So you need an alternative representation
So you
that
need
can persist. Yeah.
that information possibly replicated in the hash value or put alongside it. And we need to decide how to do that.
I mean, the digest header allows parameters to be expressed. It's just done in such a way that it's non-obvious.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the gap there. And Roberto pointed that out to me, that you have some of this capability already, but it's pretty badly expressed.
And I think that in a lot of cases, we will have implementations that build these strings with the assumption that it is just a single sequence of bits. And when they do need to get parameterized, you will find that it's a problem because you can't get the extra meta information, because no one's built it that way.
All right, we're going to have to move on, but we're going to give Roberto, as co-author here, one more chance to see if the button works. Yes. Roberto, you are on the air.
Hi, thanks for listening. Yes, I want to point out what Martin was just telling us. Having a parameterized algorithm would really solve a lot of issues. Because now with mice content encoding, you can express a signature of the digest without specifying the content coding signature because it's just mice. But this doesn't allow, for example, in signed exchanges to express multiple content codings, because signed exchanges doesn't sign the content encoding because it's fixed. While solving these issues for the digest header, we could provide some algorithm agility for both mice and other specification that builds on digest. That's it.
Thank you so much. And thank you to both of you for taking on this contribution and working to make a crisp.
Thanks for listening. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, well, if you have question, I'm here to reply. Sure. I don't want to steal time.
And for making a crisp issues list, that really helps, the process along. So thank you.
Yep.
Our next talk, it's going to be about another draft that's pretty new for us, since I believe we adopted that since we met in Prague. Using TLS 1.3 with H2, David Benjamin's been doing that work. Dave? Yeah, there he is. Come on up front so everyone can see you.
Okay, so apparently I missed the memo that was supposed to talk about this, but yeah, there's a draft. There's a slight, there's like one ambiguity with TLS 1.3, HTTP2, and like key update versus renegotiation versus post-handshake certs. There's like one important sentence in this draft plus a bunch of filler text. I think it's hopefully fairly straightforward.
So that has actually been the feedback during adoption. And I think what we wanted to use this meeting time for is see if there were any other issues that need to be opened here, because I think this is great. And if there aren't, maybe we should talk about working group last call. Martin, are you going to ruin that dream?
No, Martin Thompson, working group last call, please. I don't want this to last any longer than the 3 seconds that David just used to the microphone.
Then please sit down.
All right. So Brian, further feedback, I think you'll see a working group call open, at the end of this week. Thanks. And thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Is that our fastest draft ever?
Yeah, that might be setting a record, but don't count them before they're published, Mark. Proxy status. Excellent.
Hey, my name is Piotr Sikora. I'm going to talk about the proxy status header that Mark Nottingham and myself put together and presented at the last IETF. Next slide. As a quick reminder, proxy status is a header that contains detailed information about why a particular request failed or succeeded in its journey through various intermediaries, CDNs, reverse proxies, and whatnot. This is not a new concept. It's been done many times. We're just trying to standardize it. Next slide. So what changed since the last IETF? First of all, the draft was adopted by the working group, so thank you for that. We've also made some editorial changes and aligned no identifier with the cache draft. Next slide, please. There are two open issues. We have time, so I can go through them quickly. Next slide, please. First of the issues is about adding detailed status types for HTTP request errors. So right now we have about a dozen of types for response errors, but we have only one for request errors. It's called HTTP request error, and we piggyback on the status codes to convey the information about why the particular request failed. This is kind of unfortunate because the header is not self-contained. So recipient needs to look at both the proxy status type and the HTTP response code to figure out why the request failed. It also means that we are kind of constrained by existing HTTP status codes in the errors we can represent, and it's much harder to extend this in the future. The internal feedback I got because of those issues is that we would basically put the details in the freeform details parameter, but since it's freeform, we wouldn't really be standardizing anything, so that's kind of unfortunate. The only downside of this issue, suggestion is that we would basically be duplicating information in some of the common status, the errors for existing status codes, but I don't think that's too much of a big deal.
I kind of do. So we've been talking back and forth about this. I don't think it's a huge source of disagreement, but information from the working group I think would help.
Alessandro Ghedini, Cloudflare. I don't really have information, just a question. Does this mean that any new status codes would need to define a new proxy status kind of type?
No, absolutely. Actually, the opposite. So if we keep the current design and you have like a status field on it, in the current design, a new status code doesn't require any changes to this. It just means that, so if it's a 411 length required, all that the presence of the proxy status field means is that this was generated by a proxy, not by the origin server behind them. And as a reminder in this draft, we use proxy somewhat generously to mean forward proxy or reverse proxy gateway, any kind of intermediary node.
Right, but like there you have the length required explanation and then the proxy status,
right? Which
kind of
in the second proposal, where we have a specific proxy status type for each kind of client error, if we had a new error status code defined, we would have to define one of these as well.
So I kind of prefer the first one, but I'm fine either way.
Yeah, on the contrary, like if we want to add new status type, we would also need to make a draft that adds new status code, right? Whereas this is easier if we can extend it.
Or we'd have to come up with a way to either refine the semantics of an existing one or define a new proxy status and lump it onto an existing status code. Yeah. So like 400 or 500 probably, because they're the generic ones.
Yeah. Any more opinions? Okay, next slide, please. The second issue is about handling of forwarded responses. It's actually mistake on the slide. It should be forwarded, not non-error. So right now, all the status types we have are generated by the proxy itself. The only exception when that's not true is the HTTP response status, which basically means that the response was forwarded from the next hop as is, without any modifications. Mark thinks it's kind of confusing, and the suggestion here was to add new informational proxy info header that would carry the information about each node, so we would still retain the ability to do HTTP trace routing and stuff like that, and keep proxy status only for the responses generated by the intermediaries.
And so the idea here is that when you see a proxy status header field on a response, you know that the status code, the actual response, was generated by an intermediary if we have this split. Whereas proxy info would be information added incrementally to the response, whatever information, opportunistic information about the connection that we might use for debugging or whatever, without having that response generated on the actual proxy node.
So, Chris Clemens from Comcast. So under the previous proposal, it was possible for, if I understood correctly, for multiple proxies in the chain to have generated responses, right? And there could theoretically be, one of the proxies could be returning a cached error, and then another proxy could be saying, well, I got an error from upstream, and so I generated this response.
Correct.
Was that actually impossible? Because it was possible to express.
I don't think you'd see it, practically speaking, no.
Okay.
Except for that, except for this HTTP response status one. That's the odd man out.
Yeah, that's the one. But I think you could still see it for, in case of different configurations, like if you get too big response from one or the other, or like one of the low proxies closer to downstream.
But I think all the current semantics we have, none of them would be taken from cache. They would all be.
Yeah, not necessarily from cache, but yeah, from. It was in theory possible, but I'm not sure if it was practical.
Yeah.
Been a little bit since I've read the draft, but could you wind up with a situation where somebody marked something as stale, and so you had a success?
Are you thinking of
That's
the
different
cache header?
draft.
That's a different header, different draft.
Distinctly possible.
But similar, yes. And so, yeah, and this is, a larger discussion of we're decomposing these different mechanisms and making sure that they're well aligned. This is about really just intermediary nodes and their behaviors, whereas that draft is about caches, which can be in intermediaries, but they can also be in other places. So.
One more.
Roy Fielding.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, just in general, I know people are very fond of these very long names in header fields. I hate them, particularly when they're repeating something that's a 3-digit code in the HTTP response already. So how about in the cases where the proxy status is just indicating that the proxy is sending this code, just use the 3-digit code instead of HTTP_response blah blah blah.
So I think the proxy, if we do this split, so that's a different issue really, but if we do this split, then the proxy status header field will only occur in error responses, which are relatively rare. So while I generally agree with your sense there, it's not like it's going to be in every message. Having said that, I'm happy to have a discussion or open an issue and talk about making these things a little bit smaller where it's appropriate.
Yeah, part of it is that I think that at this point the response codes are more meaningful than the things that are written out in English. Keeping in mind that not everyone's an English reader.
So HTTP response status is an unusual one, and I think we're discussing how it's unusual right now. The other ones are more descriptive.
Yeah, if you can maybe do the previous slide, I think it was. no, this is also a good example. Maybe do the second slide. So basically, the main target of this header is responses from the origins, right? And right now, basically the only solution we have in HTTP Word is 502 bad gateway or 504 gateway timeout, right? We here have defined at least 20 or more status types that describe in more details why this happened, right? And this is something that all the companies, not all, but like a lot of companies, especially CDNs, did in the past, so there is clearly need for that. And I don't believe that existing response codes convey this information.
And in particular, there's sometimes pressure to add new status codes or people, grab their own status codes to refine these semantics. And so this is really kind of refining the semantics in the header and trying to standardize that.
Brian Call, Verizon Media. So we do this in Apache Traffic Server. We have something like this, but we do it via header, and in there we encode every host, and then we basically have all the status codes of what happened if it was a RAM cache hit, if it was disk cache hit. We have all the when we encode all that stuff as like error codes and everything. And one thing about that is having them for each hop is you have the host name and you have all of the status codes for each one of them. Instead of this, you're going to have to like parse it out in like multiple headers and figure out exactly what the status codes for each one of those are.
So,
so it seems like you would couldn't you add this to like forwarded or something like that? And then you have all of the protocol information, you have all of the.
Forwarded is a request header though.
Yes.
Yeah, but here he's using via in the response.
Right.
Yeah.
So, that's a much larger discussion, which we've got the cache header, which is intended to have the cache state.
Yeah.
Proxy info is basically the intermediary state.
Yes.
And this is proxy status if we accept this proposal is just for a proxy generated error page, effectively.
Yep.
So that's the current breakdown.
So if I understand correctly, you have more of the first example here, right? So we have, you currently use something that's more similar to the current draft, which gives details about each hop, correct?
Yeah, it gives details about each hop.
I mean, I've used that scheme, and perhaps because it was undocumented for so long, I found it difficult to work with.
It actually works pretty well, except for decoding that string.
Yes.
That we have actually a special program that takes the 20, you can have an extended version of it, and it's just like 24 characters, and then yes, you translate it. I agree, that's kind of difficult for end users. I mean, for experts and stuff like that, it's not a big deal. End users and laymen, it may be very difficult. But I think something that's shows you your hops, gives you status in each one might be easier to do than to have it broken up into multiple headers.
Right.
That's my opinion.
We're going to have to cut the line after Martin and Jabber, I suppose.
Roy Fielding from Jabber. I agree when it's new information and not an existing code.
Sorry, I need a little more context.
This is back about
the labels.
Can you go back about this basically? So not to avoid duplication of the same status code. So just stick to existing solution, I think. Yeah.
So Martin Thompson, I'm looking at this proposal here. I've just skimmed through the discussion. Can you explain to me the relationship between this and VIA and CDN loop? And we're starting to accrue a couple of these things.
Yeah.
That would be really helpful.
Sure. So VIA is effectively, I think in a lot of people's minds, unusable for anything useful. And so cache loop, CDN loop effectively abandoned that for some purposes and drove down to a very specific purpose. CDN loop is a request header, and it's targeted just at certain kinds of nodes. So it's very separable from this. Cache is for caches, and so a cache would generate it on a response. Sorry, cache, what are we going to call it now? Cache status?
Yes.
Cache status. Got to take that PR. This is for intermediaries. And as I explained before, the breakdown that's being proposed is to break that between just general intermediary context and intermediary generated errors, which are different things. Because from a CDN standpoint, for example, you often have to add a little bit of extra context to responses for debugging, and that's a very typical thing to do. But an error page, often people will write scripts depending upon that. You need those scripts to be robust. And so separating that information out makes it a little more obvious that this is, yes, a CDN or a reverse proxy or proxy-generated error page, and treat that as a special case.
Right, thanks. That makes me think that the second direction that you're proposing is, for at least the proxy status header field, a reasonable course to take. But I'm a little concerned about sort of submarining in a whole new proxy information field that's somewhat like VIA, but not entirely.
So somewhat what?
It's somewhat like VIA, but not entirely. It's sort of, well, that one didn't work out, so we're just gonna make another one.
It's effectively
and
VIA
we're
with
just gonna
semantics.
sneak it in here.
Yeah.
That's
VIA has no semantics and no structure. It is just a blob.
Sure, that's what you've just done here, isn't it?
No. No, that's a structured header. And
Oh,
we'll
well,
define
of course,
semantics
it's a
for it.
nice thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
that's the
think
proposal.
and it includes parameters like the forward protocol, for example, so how we connect it to other peer, to next hop and stuff like that. So it can be extended other than just the node name.
So I guess what I'm suggesting here
All right,
is
so
that
Mark, we
there's
do
another
need to
document
move
as
on,
well.
but as Tommy says, it's only the illusion of progress, because we're going to move on to the cache HTTP response header, so you can probably continue this discussion in that vein.
I would, if you do 3 seconds, I'm suggesting that you move that concept into a separate document and progress that separately, because otherwise this is.
You mean split proxy info separated from proxy status?
I think so. I don't know.
I think
let's talk about it.
If it becomes
later.
a blocker, I'm willing to split it off, but I don't think it's going to. But one of the reasons to split it in a separate header is that the semantics are a little bit different, but very rich on both sides. And mashing it all together is going to make it a really complex header. So. All right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, next up is the cache header. Hello, computer. So, this document, and we have 2 open issues, I think. One very slight one, which we referred to briefly before. The name of the header, I think the proposal is to call it cache status. I think there was some computer. Oh, there we go. So, I don't care. The other issue was a little more interesting. Alex Rusakov, who, if folks don't know him, is from the old Squid days, said on List a while back when this first came out, if we're going to standardize this, then it's reasonable to ask whether we want to just effectively pave the cow paths. The cache X cache, which is why we called it cache originally, because you just take the X off. Started as in Squid and maybe even back in Harvest, I forget. There might be something you can answer that. And it was accreted over time in what arguably is a really non-optimal way. And so, the question is, do we want to replicate that because everybody's very comfortable and understands what those things mean, including not only implementers, but also people who are consuming these things? Or do we want to refactor it and start from scratch effectively and make it a little cleaner and a little more obvious? Because some of the combinations of these things or the corner cases cause a lot of confusion. And so personally, I am pretty neutral about it. I am very comfortable with Xcache and I understand it. I think I understand it. There are some corners in there that are probably pretty hairy. I took a straw man approach to how would we break this thing up into different facets, and I put that into the issue. And so if people want to take a look at that, I just want to hear people's impressions of which way they want to go on this, especially from implementers, because this thing has to get implemented. And if it's the difference between, oh yeah, it's just like Xcache, therefore I can just reuse that code and I can support this thing, versus here's a whole new thing and I can't be bothered implementing these new things. That's important to know. And from consumers, I want to hear which way you'd want to consume this information.
On the topic of your first thing, from Roy, I'd really, really, really prefer this to be cache status.
Most people seem to agree with Roy. Yeah. So I think we're going to go ahead and change that.
Colin from Cloudinary. So one comment I was going to add to the previous discussion as well to this one, we currently emit these as part of our server timing headers that we emit because it's picked up available in JavaScript land. And so the semantics are now duplicating in some of these contexts of having a normalized structured data, but also having it represented there. So one consideration might be to see how we can merge some of these or have an bridge into the HTML spec so we can have access to some of these headers for beaconing purposes. So that's the purpose we use them for, is to collect statistical data from the client side on performance, et cetera.
Sure. So we can probably have that conversation maybe with the fetch folks.
For sure. The second is, do you have a notion of opting in for these additional headers for debug mode flag to?
Sure. I think for the time, for the scope of this, we haven't discussed this explicitly, but my assumption has been that currently it's a case-by-case basis. Different CDNs have different approaches to turning on debug mode, and they have different threat models for exposing that information. Likewise, different proxies are going to be configured in different ways. And so if we try to come up with some sort of negotiation or triggering mechanism for this, I think we'd probably raise the chances that this is going to fail. So right now, we're just going to focus on defining the semantics and the syntax. And then if we can later down the road get to some agreement about how does one turn on debugging for CDN/reverse proxies, hey, that's great. But we don't have to couple it to defining these semantics and syntaxes, in my opinion.
Matt Stock, Limelight Networks. Yeah, I mean, in regards to implementation, I think that unless somebody was really driving us to actually go and refactor this, it would be a hard sell to actually go and do it. So as much as I like the idea of refactoring, making it clean, I think in practice it would be tricky to do.
That actually brings to mind one of my concerns about keeping the current approach is that from what I've observed, different reverse proxies and forward proxies and CDNs use all the squid tags, but they all mean slightly different things. And there's going to be a great temptation for everybody just to say, okay, let's just take that code and put a new header name on it, and diddle the syntax, and we're done. And they won't be done because now we won't have good interop. So I'm a little worried about that.
Chris Lemon speaking for myself.
Without the laptop, okay.
Yeah, without the laptop. I was going to bring up exactly the point that you just made. The different caches and intermediaries have slightly different interpretations of some of these words, and to me, some of the value is defining the words very specifically and concretely with all capital letters, and then any system that wants to produce these header fields can produce will read the definitions and produce that. And I'm a little bit concerned that if we make it look very, very close to what is already out there, then we're not going to get good interop.
So my current inclination after listening to this is that, if we're able to write down a new thing accurately, which is maybe a big if, or precisely enough that it's can be held to truly, we might get something out there that gets more interop, but gets there more slowly. That it'll take more effort for implementers to adopt it. Better, yeah, but better, yeah. And so I'd be inclined to do this actually, based on this little discussion. Do any cache implementers want to, of any sort in any device in HTTP, want to say anything about how likely or unlikely they would be to implement that?
Alessandro Ghedini, Cloudflare. So the more complicated one can, in the end, be implemented by just taking the previous status and then sort of converting it into different, splitting it up in different values. Mm-hmm. So I think it wouldn't be that hard to implement. maybe not directly in, say, the web server, but maybe in something more higher level that customizes the responses. So I think that would be fine. The only kind of problem I would have is, at least for us, this information is mostly intended to be consumed by humans. So like you do the request, and then you get the header, and then you immediately see it's a hit or a miss. So with like a bunch more fields, it might be harder for people to interpret the result. But other than that, I'm fine with the.
Right. So maybe try and work out some examples and see how human readable they are, and tweak based on that. I can see that. Yeah.
So I see Brian getting in line. Don't know what he's going to say, but I was going to say from the Apache traffic server community, I think it's pretty likely somebody will implement that. I can think of some folks on my team that have a desire for this kind of information.
Roberto Peon. So the browsers also have a cache, and probing that cache and or requesting things from that cache has been either non-existent or problematic from the point of view of the application. For instance, there's this push thing, and we have no way of knowing that we got it because of push, let's say. That's a separate issue potentially, but maybe not. And I think there's a separate question we should be asking about this, is how we should be using HTTP probing the local cache as opposed to a remote cache.
Brian Call, Apache traffic server. So we, looking at all the different status codes you have for cache, the only one that we went ahead and expanded on from the squid codes was the refresh RAM. So we actually specify if it's actually from RAM cache, which is helpful for us. And that would be the only thing that I would add on there.
Okay, thanks. We'll probably accommodate that in some little extension or detail field or something, yeah.
So expanding on that particular idea from Thomas Peterson, is there not room for allowing freeform values here for implementations that can't fit in any of these fields? And speaking for myself, I had a very similar question, especially around the RAM and a few other pieces.
We need a good extensibility story, and then we want to drive people towards common values because that's the whole point. But yeah, there needs to be an escape valve, and that's a discussion we need to have, definitely. But I wanted to get the general high-level shape together first. Thanks.
Thanks for the discussion. And Mark, what do you think the next step is?
I'm going to go ahead and refactor it and put a draft out, and let's see if people can, I'm sure we'll have discussions about individual semantics. That's where I think we need to really focus next.
So on our agenda, that takes us through sort of the newest additions to our set of adopted drafts, and let's see if we can keep that energy going into the folks that have been with us in our little Httpbis family a little longer. So we'll move on to variants. Variants next.
Yes. Variants is a little more venerable, definitely. We haven't made much progress on this because we put a pin in it to wait for implementation experience. And I have assurances from my one generous and unnamed potential implementer in the immediate future that he might be able to get to something soon. He or she might be able to get to something soon. But in this, and it is also being used by the Site Exchange's proposal for a little bit different purposes, but there's still an interesting use case there. And what's nice there is it also kind of validates that as a framework, it's working pretty well because they're exercising it more than we are theoretically. It struck me the other day that we might make some progress on this draft by generating a little interest in it. And by that, one of the open issues is to describe how variants might work with cookies. And I've been holding off on that because I wanted to get the basics right first. But if you're able to make this thing work with cookies, it actually opens up a lot of incredibly interesting use cases. So my thinking at this particular point is that I might want to go ahead and sketch that out and put a new draft out to see if that beats the bushes of people who might want to go and play with it a bit more. Beyond that, I don't really have anything to report. I think in a month or so ago, I went through and addressed some of the open issues, especially that Jeffrey Askin had opened against it. I think there's still a couple, but it's just iterative stuff. It's not, stuff that we need to discuss here. Any comments? Any other thoughts about that? Anybody disagree with working on this draft or not working on it or anything? Colin?
I'm in favor of it. I have actually a working copy, working implementation internally for our surrogate exchanges. So not externally focused, but surrogate variants. And it works quite well for a lot of purposes, a lot of use cases. So.
Cool. We should talk more. Thank you. That's great information. It's a good day.
I'm glad we took that little side trip. And as long as we're doing memory lane, we can talk about.
It's going to get worse.
We can talk about BCP 56bis, which I had thought was just blocked on the completion of core. So maybe we're going to learn that core will be done like at the end of Thursday's session, but Mark will let us know.
Okay, so BCP 56bis, we had said we were blocked on core. As time has progressed and we've done other things, I've left a few notes in the issues list of things that we might want to discuss before we ship it. So I haven't talked to the other chairs about this at all as to whether this is in scope or not, but there's the issue of using the word header field, but that's a core issue, not an issue for this. I think, what was this? Yes. Ben Caddock, when he was doing a last call review of 5785bis, one of the things that came up was, do we need more advice about when and how to use well-known URIs? That's something potentially we could address here. In another context, and I frankly forget where that was, some people were talking about when to use URI components versus minting new headers. Some advice about that might be good to put in there, or at least examples to understand the trade-offs when you make that choice when you're designing a protocol. And some advice about when and this has come up actually in a couple of different working groups using HTTP recently, the idea that a response has this inherent value of being either fresh or stale, and what that means in relation to your application when it consumes that response is something that applications probably need to at least be aware of, if not talk about, when you define a specification. So those are just kind of little notes that we could potentially incorporate into the spec if we as a working group decide that we're willing to add a little more text to the spec.
So we have a generic question here, of whether or not we feel this document is essentially, just done and pending on, the normative reference to core and the resolution around header field, given what core defines, or whether we want to continue sort of updating it while it's in this interim state. So if folks have comments on that, chairs would be interested in hearing.
From Roy, those all sound like core issues to me.
Well, I disagree, especially regarding 840 and probably about 787. They're very specifically about how you use HTTP, how you talk about how you use HTTP when you write a specification. And 774 too, I think, yeah.
Speaking for myself, I often discover that end users of things completely forget that stale exists. They are always surprised when something gets returned stale. And so having more visibility into that is absolutely going to increase the quality of implementations. From Roy, shrug.
I can see him shrugging right now.
So my inclination is that if people want to provide text, we can essentially treat this while it's in this sort of interim state as a living document, if you will. If we have the energy to make these kinds of updates before it's ready to technically go through last call, but that would mostly be driven by the presence of text or not coming along. And so Mark says he'll write it and there will be text. So there you go. Secondary certificates is up, and I hope we can make some progress on this one today. I don't know who wants to talk about it. Mike's going to come talk about it. Excellent.
No slides, right?
You wanted slides by Friday. I was moving into a new house on Friday. There was no way that was going to happen, so no slides. Yeah, well. So basically, last time around, we added the required domain extension to try and limit the possible attack from a compromised cert being used by an attacker. That helps with some of the situations. The lingering angst that has been relayed to me is around DNS check. And I think the path forward there may just be to try and make that not be a separate issue from this document and just say, if you would do a DNS check otherwise, you do it here. If you would not do a DNS check otherwise, you don't need to do it here. That is not part of secondary search either way. So we don't currently have an issue for that because we thought we had resolved that with the extension, but we can certainly open an issue to clarify that text. And if anybody wants to come up to the mic and suggest text, I'd prefer PR, but if we want discussion around it, that's good too. Other than that, the two open issues coming into this week were editorial, had a PR, I merged the PR, we now have no open issues. So I would say the main thing between us and last call is some actual implementations. I've heard that there's the beginning of one, but I'd like to see more than one, ideally.
That's exciting.
Yeah. And if the person who told me that they have that partial implementation wants to come up to the mic and publicly admit it.
Kyle Neckertz. We have a beginning implementation with the intention, at least beginning intention of using this for client certificates. I don't want to say this is more than it is. It's very much in the beginnings.
And if there's nothing else?
Thank you very much. So
I'm trying to figure out what that means for the working group for next step. Does that mean we feel that we are at a state where last call would be appropriate? Does anyone have any comments? This has been contentious in the past.
More specifically, do we need to see implementation or interop before we ship it?
Martin Thompson, I would very much not want to ship this as an RFC before there are interoperable implementations. Preferably deployments of those, but I'm not sure that I need to hold the line on that one. Unless anyone thinks they need an RFC number to start moving on this one, I would suggest that there's enough complexity in here that having implementations would make me a lot more confident. And that's as an author.
Nick Sullivan, Cloudflare. I'd just like to note that we have a server implementation, and so looking for clients to interrupt.
Is that something that's deployed, or is that like call me?
It's call me.
that's fine.
That's great. We can move on to structured headers, I guess.
So we've had a bit of a burst of activity on structured headers recently. If I go down to the changes, can you see that in the back? Can you read that more or less? One up? Oh, there. How's that? Great, thanks. So the important ones in since draft 10 are towards the end. 781 we closed. We allow empty dictionaries and lists now. So in the data model, those structures are allowed to be empty, whereas they weren't before. They're serialized as the header not appearing on the wire, is how it's currently spelled. If the header appears on the wire and it has an empty value, that will also successfully parse. For serialization, the normal form, as it were, is to not serialize the header. 797 was not important for discussion. 816, allow inner lists in both dictionaries and lists, and to remove that effectively obviates lists of lists as a separate top-level data structure. So now you have this, in most places where you had a member in those structures, you can either have a single thing or you can have a list of things. And after a long and enjoyable, fruitful discussion of syntax, we ended up on using parentheses and white space to delimit those lists. And it looks okay. And finally, 839 was even more interesting. We subsumed parameterized lists into lists, which means that basically lists now can have optional parameters, list items. And the winning argument for that seemed to be that when you define a structured header, it may be that in the future you want to add parameters to it. And if it's defined as a list, well, that's awkward. It's not backwards compatible. Whereas if it's all list members could potentially have parameters, then you can retroactively add parameters to an existing header field, and it's backwards compatible because of the semantics of parameters. And so the downside of that one was that potentially how you represent structured headers in programming languages and various mappings to data structures or to objects became potentially a little more complex, but the trade-off was felt to be worth it. I still have to do a lot of work on the test suite and on the sample implementation that I have in Python to validate all these changes and make sure the algorithms are absolutely correct. But we've had multiple eyeballs on it. We've got some fairly detailed feedback from PHK on the algorithms, and I feel like they're in pretty good shape. We might have a couple of bugs in there, but hopefully when I get a chance to sit down, we'll be able to really make sure that they're up to speed and the test suite is still representative and it passes. And then the other implementations will have to update as well. So that's the recent changes. The open issues, it is freaking cold in here. I want to briefly run through these if we have a little bit of time. Okay. So PHK brought this one up in his review of the latest draft, pointing out that floats, the current definition is surprisingly hard to serialize correctly, and he, of course, wrote some sample code. And then what he suggests is that if we define that SH float can have a maximum of 6 digits after the decimal point, things become quite a bit easier. And so, we've in all the decisions in structured headers, we've made this kind of trade-off of, how can we have maximal correctness and maximal interrupt and cover the 80% plus use case, knowing that we're going to drop some use cases. And so, personally, to me, this feels like the right decision. If we, the people who need that kind of precision can put something in a binary or put something in a string. Those use cases in HTTP headers are relatively uncommon. And if somebody does want to use that kind of precision and it's not interoperable or easy to implement, it's much more likely that we'll be adding to their problems, not helping them. That's my personal feeling. I'm very happy to be convinced otherwise.
So, Martin Thompson, can we confirm that this is not just a particular C library implementation that we're hitting, and it's in the C language specification, and that similar functions in other languages are not different?
So you're asking for a little research and data?
Yeah, if you're going to make this sort of change, yeah.
Sure.
Otherwise, I'd be tempted to just say, well, why don't you just roll your own stringify for a float? It's not a huge amount of code.
You're right, we do need to do more digging here a little bit. My assumption, which wasn't terribly well thought out, was that most, look at Python and Ruby and so forth, they're all going to be based upon the C libraries.
Yeah,
so.
what about Rust, or what about all of these other ones? Yeah.
Sure, but the point is interrupt. We have to we have to get these languages talking to each other. So.
Related, from Roy Fielding, do we have anyone who needs a float other than int divided by 1,000?
Right, and actually, I think in our private discussion when PHK were talking about this, one of the things that I floated was maybe just everybody uses ints, and like if you're mapping from Q values, then you say, well, this is the mapping for Q values into this different structure. Well, the only thing you really lose is the ability to potentially take an existing header that uses floats and parse it as a structured header without changing its identity. But that may be a reasonable trade-off as well.
One of the big reasons to use floats is so you can get a lot of things past that decimal point. And while this trade-off may be a perfectly fine one, let's make sure that the name actually reflects the fact that it has a really huge trade-off in its precision. So that in the future, maybe when somebody because of the presence of something that can serialize the float in a format that's not so expensive, it would be nice to actually be able to represent it. So I think we have a chicken and egg problem, and I'm just trying to I'm worried about that.
So you're saying if we do ship something like what's suggested here, that we change the name?
Yeah, and I'm also suggesting that there's a chicken and egg problem by not having a good float. We will certainly prevent it from happening. Anyway.
Sorry, I'm not quite.
It's been expensive to serialize floats.
Yep.
More expensive than other things because you have a string, the string is fairly long, right? So because of that, we don't put it in headers. Doesn't make a lot of sense.
Oh, I see. Right. You're saying that we may not have evidence of a lot of floats because it's hard.
It's been expensive.
Sure.
So if we're going to make it cheap, we should make the right thing cheap.
Sure. Do you have a suggestion for a name?
The current suggestion, because I don't want to argue this too much because I'm not really participating in this too much, is please just change the name so that if somebody does the full float, that it has the right name.
Okay, if we do that, okay. Just naming things is hard, that's all.
Yeah, I was going to observe that if you have a fixed number of elements after the point, fixed point is a name.
I see nodding heads.
Or decimal.
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 Decimal's nice.
Decimal is what it is. And if you limit the number of digits after the decimal place, you can store them in an integer, just exactly what Roy was suggesting.
So my inclination after hearing this, if I'm hearing correctly, is to go ahead and do what PHK is suggesting here, but to change the name to decimal. Workable? Anyone with heartburn?
I don't remember, do we have, if there are bounds, changing the storage is going to change our expected maximum bounds rather significantly.
Yes.
And so people may have expectations around that.
I think, well, this came about because we were, relying on a shared concept of float that wasn't well spelled out in the spec. And now it sounds like we're spelling it out to the degree of precision that we spelled out int with. So we're going to have to go through that process for this in general, I think.
Speaking for Roy Fielding, +1, fixed point.
Okay. Well, now it's a naming race.
No, name race. Fun. Martin Thompson, we have 15, 10 digits on integers. Which one of those, right?
Yeah, 15, I think.
Yeah. So just take 6 of those and put them on the right-hand side and leave the rest on the left-hand side, and there's your limits right there. I think that's concretely, that's a serious proposal. And 6 seems like a convenient number. I don't know if someone wants to pick 5 or 7, then we can argue about that one, but that's seems reasonable.
Speaking for myself, that sounds fantastic.
Okay. Martin, could you write that down on the issue so I don't forget? It's 848. Thank you. Okay, that's editorial. Star and parameter names. So it was noticed, I think when PHK and I were talking, he asked if there was any use for star, and I realized in parameter names, and I realized that star is used by RFC 5987, or as Julian corrected me, 8187. This is the internationalization coding for parameters in normal HTTP headers. And so the question is, right now, that is disallowed in parameter names in what we call keys, I think, in the current ABNF. So if you wanted to map one of these headers into structured headers, you'd need another way to denote that this is the internationalized version of that parameter. Because for those that may not have immediately paged it in as soon as I said 8187, the model of that is that there are a pair of parameters, one that is plain ASCII and one that is internationalized, so that you can fall back to the ASCII if you need to. And that's the convention for those things, in things like content disposition. And the internationalized version is denoted by, I believe, a trailing star, if I remember correctly. So it would be a non-trivial mapping. And so one thing we could do is allow stars in these parameter names. One further thing we could do, if we so felt inclined, would be to just reserve that star for that very particular use case and not for anything else. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? I see there's a fair amount of discussion recently.
If you allow it, the size of every key will be larger because you will not be able to encode it as efficiently on the wire. When we encode the keys, right, you can imagine in other protocols, revisions, that we encode the keys via a specific table, Huffman table, for instance, right? Adding another character that is not used as often will slightly expand that. It's not a huge deal, but I'm just pointing out that adding a character to the acceptable input set does actually have an impact on the size of the things that we send in the case where we're not using it, right? So if this is very rarely happening, it would be nice to disallow in structured headers and say, if you want to use structured headers, well, you get ASCII, sorry. And if you want to do some mapping, you do it in another header.
It's not even you get ASCII, it's just you can't use this convention in 8187.
Correct.
Or you can't easily use it. You have to define your own mapping to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
From Roy Fielding. +1 to just sending UTF-8 for structured headers.
That's not this issue, but yeah, noted. 842, dictionary of a dictionary. Kazuho raised this, and I think in discussion, we came to the understanding that this was basically, now that we've allowed list members to have parameters, can we do the same for dictionary members? Is that correct, Kazuho?
Yes. So I think I'm pointing about an inconsistency, and fixing this simplifies and also provides more extensibility. So I think we should do this.
I'm fine with it. I just wanted to check to see how other people felt.
What is the encoding of a dictionary containing an empty dictionary?
That's not what's being asked here. It's not, can a dictionary contain a dictionary? It's, can a dictionary member have parameters?
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's a real problem too.
No, it's not.
Speaking for Roy Fielding, it is that issue, and this would resolve it. Oh, he's right. That was Julian.
Oh.
I'm
I was
gonna
about to say, that didn't sound like Roy.
Sorry for defaming Roy.
Okay, I don't hear any pushback on adding parameters to dictionaries members, so that's good. Add a subsection on limitations. Roy asked that we add some text about limitations. I looked at this and then I looked at the spec, and I feel like it's pretty specific about what the spec is trying to do and what it's not trying to do. So I don't know what you're asking for here, Roy. So if you could give me some more information or give me some proposed text, that would be great, because I don't know how to action this request. There.
Okay, so I think this is stuck in a little bit of time, so I don't mind if you close this issue, because it's really, there were a lot of things that I found out only by reading the ABNF, and that there's no mention of it in the text, particularly having to do with how many, if you could have empty lists or empty header values. But if you've already corrected that in the text, then this no longer applies.
Okay. If you find any of those, please do open issues about those specific things. We should definitely make sure that it's unambiguous.
Roberto, and I just wanted to say, Mark is right. It's not a problem.
Okay. That's what I love to hear, more of that. One more. Okay, so I think we have ways forward on all of these, which is great. The last one is one that's been with us for a while, and we've tried to come to a consensus in quite a few ways, which is defining a URI reference type. And I understand that folks, this seems like a natural thing to do for the spec. My pushback or my concern has been that, structured headers is all about presenting type data to applications in ways that they can easily consume in a highly interoperable fashion. And that interoperability in URIs, unfortunately, the story isn't that great. If this thing is going to be implemented by browsers, it's highly, highly likely that they're going to use the the wet working group URI spec to offer that URI. And that has a different API surface than what we would expose in different parsing and processing than we would likely expose in the IETF in some very fine details. And so I'm reluctant to expose a foot gun. If we can come to some agreement that, offers the structure, because the URIs themselves are structured, that offers the structure of URIs in an interoperable fashion that's actually likely to get implemented by browsers, I'm all for it. But I don't see that as achievable in the time frame that we have in this working group for this document. And I really want to ship this document because it's starting to get a lot of things depending upon it. That's where I'm at with this.
Kazuho, firstly, my weak preference goes to not having this because we don't have date, for example, as well.
Sorry, so for not incorporating?
Having URI.
Okay, thank you. So as editor, my inclination is to close this with no action. Just to make that, if that's not crystal clear.
Martin Thompson, I'm inclined to agree simply because it's going to be very difficult to specify this correctly. Even if you sort of wave your hands rapidly about all of the various interoperability issues that we have with URIs, do you allow relative URIs? Do you allow all these sorts of questions start coming up, and what would they be relative to? It's tricky. So, and that's not even getting into character encoding problems.
From Roy, actually Roy this time. So we can't have a URI type because a non-standards org has an opinion about which spec to reference? Sad face.
It's not about the standards org, it's about the implementations. I agree with the sad face part. I do agree with the sad face.
Speaking for myself, so people are gonna need to do this. They're just gonna put it in a string type and get it wrong.
Sure.
Yeah, if we don't have a fundamental type like that because of, E too ambitious, we might want some non-normative text or something, just acknowledging that we didn't think the spec could support that. So that'll be an obvious question.
From Julian, the interop argument actually makes me think we should add this because it would actually help the consumers.
Julian, how? We can't force the browsers to do anything.
Browsers might voluntarily do things if you decided they were a good idea and we agreed.
And
I mean, we're in the room.
And yet Anna Van Kesteren just woke up and said, what?
Rolled over in his, yeah.
Julian says, because we would define how it works.
Yeah, we could define how it works.
So this was specifically brought up, and the feedback we got was that if they have a API and parsing code for URIs already in the browser, they are very strongly disinclined to use anything else.
Right.
Roy Fielding says, I don't care what the recipient does with the string. I just want the sender to tell me it's a reference to a URI.
So actually to that specific point, the specification defining the structured header always defines its semantics. And it can certainly say this string is a URI, just like it can say this string is somebody's name.
Julian says, +1 to what Roy said.
Matt Stock, Limelight. So yeah, I think that this kind of runs counter to the whole there's already existing implementations and we're just going to do a cut and paste of what's there. And unlike what we were talking about with floating point, we can't play any like realistic scoping reductions to make the problem simpler. So.
Yeah, Ryan Sleevey, Google works on Chrome, and sadly one of the folks maintaining the URL side. I support what Mark was proposing here, which is punting this issue. And the unfortunate part of it is that one of the challenges that would be with implementing this, and one of the benefits of structured headers, is that you get that error processing model, right? You understand what is a valid or invalid model. And the whole reason why we have that joint W3C, just to be clear, there is an SDO behind it. You know, what WG fetch spec is that challenge, which is a lot of the URI processing model was ill-defined in terms of error handling correctly. And so there's issues that exist out there on the web that don't conform, and we deal with that mess that we have. So the challenge of trying to like do this now for structured headers is trying to define that error processing model, and that is a yak shave that's been going on for nearly a decade, and it's slightly more hairless, which is great, but it's not there yet.
I might be alone here, but it seems like there are two advantages to structured headers, one of which we are talking about right now, and the lack of that one, we're excluding the other. To be specific, there is how we encode things on the wire, which could potentially be more efficient. And then there is how we represent it to the user, which in this particular case, we're suggesting we're probably going to end up having be text. If we can get some advantages by having a shorter encoding, because we know it's a URI and we know who we're talking to, that might be worthwhile, even if we just serialize it to text. So it may be that it's useful on the wire. So I think we should be talking about these things separately, how we present versus how we serialize or store.
I think part of my concern is it's almost an attractive nuisance that if you define it as a URI, some implementations are going to present it with an API on top of that. And then that's going to cause interoperability problems. I mean, really, this specification is a big game of chicken that, you know, we're defining this as precisely as we can to try and encourage a high level of interop. But it's always up to the implementers to actually toe that line. And if we have one major implementation that decides it's going to go off and go cowboy, it's kind of all over, you know. So.
Roy says, then why even have any strong typing?
What, URIs or nothing?
The lack of a specification does not prevent somebody from going cowboy.
I'll leave it to the chairs to decide how to proceed. Hum the shit out of it, please. Yeah.
If we held a hum, how many people would participate? I'm just kind of curious here.
Keeping in mind that this is effectively what's keeping this spec open.
Okay, so we're going to have three options. First option is we don't define anything for the URI and we leave the text as is. Second option is we decide it is critical to define something for the URI and that needs to be proposed. And then the third option is you don't know enough yet and you want to leave this document in limbo and make the author sad. Martin, do you want to?
Yeah, so on the second point there, just for clarification, that would be making the statement that we have to define the processing rules for the URI in detail. Tackle this, shave the yak.
At some level, we'd have to define
Yes,
API.
at some level.
Strong definition.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Right. Okay, so
Please hum now if you believe that we should leave out a definition of URI and leave the document as is. Hum. Okay. Please hum now if you believe we should add a strong definition of a URI to this document. And please hum now if you don't know and you think we should continue discussing this. All right, seems pretty clear that we are going to leave URI out. Thank you, everyone.
So what do we spend all that time talking about? Let's move on.
Okay. Well, that's great. That's progress. So we'll take it. Next draft on the agenda, we are down to 2 of our adopted drafts, client hints, and Yoav's coming up, and Ilya's in the house. This is great.
Hey, hi. Yoav Weiss, Google. Let's talk about client hints. There were no major draft changes since Prague, other than a few PRs that are currently in the air. But I wanted to discuss the issues. There are, various open issues that are worth discussing. The first is a sec-ch-prefix. We had various people that are interested in adding namespace for client hints, similar to, for example, there's the sec-fetch namespace for various fetch-related request headers. And otherwise, the sec-prefix is something that is pretty important from a course perspective and from a perspective of making sure that these headers are something that only the browser can set and cannot be set by usually on JavaScript. At the same time, Julian had objections to the -ch prefix, as if I try to channel him, that can create conflicting namespaces that we don't have any plan of unconflicting. So for example, if we'll have multiple of those namespaces, like a request that falls into 2 namespaces, how do we represent that? So I'm wondering if anyone else has if anyone has objections to the sec- prefix, because this one I think is critical for the fetch processing model. And then I'm wondering if anyone here has strong opinions regarding the -ch, like the ch- addition to that as a namespace for general request headers.
So, Yoav, can I just try and clarify? Sec- turns off client access in fetch access to the headers.
Yes.
And personally, I think pragmatically, that's probably a good thing to be doing here. What does ch in the prefix give us? Does it change any software's behavior?
No.
Okay.
It's a convention.
So it seems a little unnecessary then to add that. Like, you could say it's a convention, say, if you want to flag this as, just to humans as, hey, this is a client hint, fine, but by saying it's a prefix, that kind of implies some sort of automated handling, and that's maybe causing the confusion here.
I don't think there's confusion, but I am willing to accept that, we need to, so you're saying, if I understand what you're saying that features that use the client hint infrastructure are of liberty to add that prefix if they so wish, but
if I define a client hint and I fail to call it sec-ch- something, it's still a client hint for all intents and purposes.
Okay.
Nothing special would happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just when you start inferring things based upon prefixes is when you get into a bit of a mess, if there are multiple facets to the prefix. Because, if we define 5 more prefixes, and then you have an ordering problem. Yay, so.
Yeah.
And I remember we had this whole discussion when sec came out, and my objection was, well, what happens when we define the 2nd and 3rd prefixes? And lo and behold, here we are. So.
Okay, so we're dropping the CH piece.
Personally, like, I'm not telling you what to do, but personally, if it were me,
Okay.
I would just say, for security reasons, I think there's a whole other discussion to be had about whether sec dash is always required on the request header or whether it's for just, it's a case by case thing. I think there could be an argument that some client hints are okay to expose to JavaScript, but that's, case by case. And so I personally would be like, okay, every client hint needs to evaluate whether it needs this prefix. And if you want to be friendly, put CH in the front just so that people know that it's a client hint, but it's not required.
Okay.
That's personally how I would do it.
Okay.
Speaking for myself, Chris Lemons, if there's a convention, even if it's not mandatory, if, for example, even all of the examples have CH in front of them, somebody's going to write some software assuming that. They're going to enumerate all of the headers that have CH in them.
Right. And that may be, but it won't actually break like the browsing use case, which is the main target here.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I think the key thing that we're looking for here is defining the set of rules that we're setting out for people defining new client hints. And the key property that we're looking for, I think, is that they all have sec in front of them. Is that right?
That is correct.
Are we requiring this?
Maybe. That was what I was just bringing up. Yeah.
Right. And so Mark's suggested that maybe that's not a strong requirement. That may be the case. I talked about this in the past. Whatever the conclusion was, I think we should stick with it. I like that framing of the thing that Mark had, so add one to that.
Cool. So from my perspective and from a fetch processing perspective, I think it will be significantly simpler and easier if all of them had a sec prefix and we wouldn't muck around with multiple options there. Okay. So moving on to the next issue, move to structured headers. Any objections to that? Okay, cool. Ship it. Third issue is active versus passive fingerprinting. At the last, like in Prague, we had a lively discussion around whether client hints are a passive fingerprinting vector or an active one. Earlier today, we had a discussion with the Mozilla folks, and I think we have reached some form of understanding regarding the actual concerns there. Martin, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, Martin Thompson again. There has been, I think we got a better mutual understanding of where things are. We haven't fully investigated the propagation of client hints into third-party browsing contexts, which requires a little bit more thought on our part, and we'll find someone to look into that in a bit more detail, someone who's more familiar with what our policies are regarding third-party browsing, third-party context. The question about whether this constitutes a new surface area for passive fingerprinting and various other passive use of information. I think we're getting closer on this point. The key concern seems to be around the properties of the individual client hints that we're talking about. And some of them you can imagine being quite easy. So if we imagine that we had accept language turned into a client hint, which I think we want to do, that's essentially static and very rarely changes. DPR and some of these things are very static in the thing. And so when you release, when a site says, I would like access to that, we can look at that one access and treat that as a single point of access. And then we don't have to worry so much about the information being relayed to the site thereafter, because it's always going to be the same. Viewport is a little more interesting because it does change over time, and there's a couple of things that do change over time. And then at the extreme end, we have something like geolocation, which has constant changing properties. But it may be the case that what we're concerned about there is that this is also a property that is behind a permission gate or some other thing like that, and has additional policies around its use. And so we need to understand how that interacts with that as well. So what we've suggested is that we start being very crisp about what it is that we're using to decide whether something's okay to use in this context, and be very clear about what principles drive that, and allow for different browser implementations to make different decisions about what they may or may not want to use in this context. So it might be that if we've got a property that's available to script passively that doesn't change very often, everyone's happy with that one. There may be some other ones that the information's only available if there's an engagement gesture. And so that might be completely unsuitable for use in this context, because we want to be able to directly correlate that action with the property being released to the site. And so there's a little bit more work to do on this one, but I think the core of the realization here that we've reached is that we need to allow for different policies to be enacted by different browsers, and potentially even different user preferences and whatnot, because we each have a different posture with respect to this sort of information. And so the problem I think we were struggling with is that we were trying to encode policy in these documents. And I think by having that realization, we may find ourselves in a slightly better position.
Thank you. Yeah, so I believe that the way forward here is to try to formulate some set of these policies and then potentially add them to the security and privacy consideration section. And and then we can move forward on that front.
So with that, this may be the most fully formed and well thought out privacy consideration section in any RFC ever. So thank you for doing that. I know this has been hard, but I think we're getting pretty close to this being a good thing. And I do want to start using this for things like user agent. So people, this is fair warning, user agent is now on death row.
So do I hear you correctly in saying that this actually is making you think about implementing? For some, not all, but for some clients. Good. That's actually really great news. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And the last issue is it was a long title, so I summed it up as exposure to CDNs. I don't believe Peter Snyder is here today, but yeah, in his absence, we'll discuss this. Basically, if I try to sum up the claims in the issue, is that client hints, because they are structured and readable, automatically readable, they expose those expose values that servers have opted into to other parties on the wire, which are typically, because this is restricted to HTTPS, are either CDNs or MITM proxies. And the claim is that this will enable those parties to log that sensitive information. And I believe the question sums up to, are CDNs part of the threat, like the privacy threat model? Because they can, like if you're MITMing TLS, or like if you're terminating TLS, you can already inject JavaScript and do all kinds of bad things if you so wish. And I don't think that logging that potential fingerprintable information is on the top of those bad things. So
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, the CDN is the origin from the perspective of the browser. So what the CDN wants to do with this information is the business of the origin server and the CDN. They can sort that out amongst themselves. I don't think that represents any special privacy problem, and I don't think it's worth documenting that. And if we're going to start talking about interception proxies, we're into all sorts of problems, and I'm not signing on for that, and I don't expect anyone else to have to.
So Ryan Sleevey, Google. And as much as I hate to rehash something that Mark thought we'd closed out, there's a lot of discussion when we were developing the browser web crypto API in terms of why are some folks going to use this. And one of the common cases for sort of client-side encryption, even though...
Sorry, Ryan, could you just get a little closer?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. One of the discussions with why would you do browsers client-side encryption for things was an example to prevent information from being accidentally logged, right? There's been multiple security breaches of, say, vendors accidentally logging passwords, then causing issues. So in that argument in which it says that this is not a threat from an adversarial threat model, it is a threat from an incidental or accidental operational failure, and this is the part that makes Mark unhappy, is the reintroduction of a prefix to indicate for intermediaries, you perhaps should not log sec.ch, anything in that prefix, on the basis that if we assume that client hits, as Martin was talking about, may contain some identifying information or may themselves be fingerprinting, the ability to have that structure allows for filtration on the server side to prevent the incidental logging of that information, the same way that one might say should filter out cookie or other headers. In a structured header, this might be a single field, so you might not need the CH prefix.
So sorry, we're talking exclusively about the previous issue, effectively.
We're suggesting that the CDNs are not the adversarial threat model; they're incidental. But yeah, reintroducing a prefix.
Sure. My immediate question would be: is there any difference between the headers that need a sec as a prefix and the headers that need a different flag for this threat model?
That is an excellent question. It is very much a general problem. Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So Martin Thompson, on that point, though it is a good one, and I think Ryan's onto something that we need to think about more generally when we start talking about adding header fields. I tend to think that these are very much designed for consumption by CDNs. And so accidental logging aside, this is something that CDNs probably want to log because it's going to be changing their behavior. And so if we think about it in that context, maybe we'll find that going to those extra effort, putting the extra effort in to make them distinguishable so that they can't be logged isn't really of much use when they're going to end up in the logs anyway.
So it sounds like maybe there's a little interest in saying, please, in your operational practices, realize that this is sensitive information, potentially, whether it's in a CDN, whether it's on an origin server, in a database, or wherever. Is that?
And I think that is the right balance to strike here, is recognizing that this could be identifiable information, particularly once we start to get to the point where there's enough entropy in here to narrow things down quite a lot. And so recognizing that and just putting it in there, saying that when someone handles this information, they treat it with respect. Motherhood and apple pie, but do it anyway. Yeah.
So extending the care that the sec prefix implies through the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Does that give you the information you need?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay. Okay, and then new and exciting developments. HTTP SSVC enables us to solve one of the long-standing issues related to adoption. People have wanted to use client hints
as a way to to perform adaptation on the navigation response, so typically on the HTML itself. And that has always been a thorny point. We added except CH lifetime in order to address it in future HTML related negotiations, but it didn't address the very first request. And pushing that except CH signal to DNS will enable us to solve that problem. I wrote a PR that adds an alt service extension to client hints. It's not clear that this David Benjamin have commented on that, basically saying that it has a few different characteristics from other things that are currently in alt service. So maybe alt service is not the right answer here, but I would love to find a path forward to push the opt-in to DNS as well, on top of just being a header.
Okay, I think we're going to treat that as an FYI, because we're going to talk about HTTP service on Thursday, and it might come up after that or not. And we're running low on time.
Okay.
We have another substantial discussion to have. So.
Sounds good. And yeah, the last question is, can we move forward, or what? Like, it seems like we have a path forward for all the open issues.
It seems like the next thing to do is to incorporate those, finish those discussions, get a new draft out, and it sounds like last call is looming to me. I think, at least on the horizon, perhaps.
Yeah, it feels like we have like a path forward, as you say. So let's see the text, see if we get consensus around the text. But I think that's definitely worth changing, right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the engagement. Yeah. Do you have anything to say on the cookies draft?
Let's move on.
Okay, so we are going to skip the cookies draft and move on to the priority conversation. So I think Ian has a presentation for us. It's a little bit of a teaser to get things going.
So do I have 15 minutes to get through this in comments?
Yep.
Yep. Sorry. Okay. So it should be challenging. My name is Ian Sweat. I'm from Google, and I'm talking about HTTP3 priorities and to some extent HTTP2 priorities. I talked about this briefly at the Quick Interim in London, and here's kind of an overview of where we're at today and what are some ideas of the HTTP3 work group members. Next slide. So it all began with a coin flip. I was not there. I know some of you were. And I know there are two competing proposals, and the tree-based proposal, next slide, won. So HTTP2 priority tree is essentially, it's what you have here. There are weights, and nodes can have parents. Streams can depend on streams, or they can depend on this implicit root. So there's been a fair amount of discussion historically on the list about the challenges of streams depending on streams in certain circumstances. There's also this concept of placeholders, which I'll talk about briefly later, but which is basically like a stream that doesn't really exist. And it just exists so you can have something that you can reference for a very long period of time. And Firefox actually uses this, as you'll see later. So RFC 7540 has a much nicer description. So given my time, I'm going to keep moving forward. Yeah, so one way of thinking about them, and the way I usually think about them, is that strict prioritization is implicit and encoded in the tree structure, and the weights allow you to share bandwidth between nodes, where the nodes might either be streams themselves or like trees of streams. So next slide. So how do browsers use H2 priority? Next slide. So Chrome uses a linked list, essentially. So it just puts everything in one big long list, and that gives it strict ordering. So it knows exactly which thing is higher priority than the other thing. This is very straightforward and maps relatively well to its 5 priority levels that it has internally in the browser. Next slide. Firefox creates this placeholder model where it uses 5 placeholders. And separates things into buckets based on whether or not they're render blocking resources or background, so on and so forth, and uses weights and dependencies to kind of trade off between them. but it uses weights a little bit more than Chrome does. Next slide. Safari does use weights, and kind of just puts render blocking resources at higher weights than other things. I didn't actually put Edge in here. It was originally in here, but the last time I checked, now in Edgeium, I believe Edge just does what Chrome does. Prior to that, it just didn't send anything at all and used the default, which was pure round robin with no weighting whatsoever. Next slide. Let me give you a quick overview of a few of the other, both where we're at for H3 right now, as well as some alternate proposals proposed on the list. First by Patrick Meenan, and then subsequently discussed by a variety of other working group members, including Lucas and Kazuo. Next slide. Next slide, sorry. Next. No. Okay. Sorry, I'm just I need to save my time. Strict prioritization. So conceptually, the H2 priority tree that we discussed previously, it's really clean. Like you have two concepts. You have basically who you're a parent of and a weight, and it provides you a huge amount of power and a lot of flexibility. But it has some challenges, and it provides a lot of functionality that in reality browsers really are not using and do not need. And some of that complexity embodies itself in the implementations as well. So next slide. H3 priorities actually are, you can argue this, but most people think they're slightly more complex as they are currently specified than H2 priorities. They add explicit placeholders instead of having implicit ones. So whether this is more or less complex than implicit ones maybe is a point of contention. But in order to ensure consistency, all priority frames are now sent on the control stream. So you can't send priority as part of the request itself, because you may have issues with, does this priority apply first, or does this one apply first? And you basically get tree inconsistency because you're trying to maintain distributed state at a distance and you have no head-of-line blocking. So the only way to really fix that is to put them on the control stream. So you've actually reintroduced head-of-line blocking into a protocol that we would like not to have head-of-line blocking in. However, we solved this by adding this orphan placeholder concept. So the idea is really we probably want the default to be FIFO, not round robin. And so in order to achieve that, we've created something that's basically if you're not really sure how to prioritize this thing, you put it at the root and you service it after everything else, is one way of thinking about it. So it's also been proposed as a 0 weight option. I think functionally they're quite similar, but the goal here is to achieve FIFO by default, especially when the priority information is lost, because now it's on a different stream and it's not embedded in the request header. Next slide. Cool. So Patrick Meehan on the list around January or February of this year proposed something that's largely a speedy style numerical priority. Originally had 2 bits for concurrency. Now we simplified it to 1. So this is basically saying, everything has kind of a strict prioritization, higher priorities are serviced before lower priorities. And then either you want a request sequentially, so you want the entire response all at once, or you'd like it round robin with other requests. There are a few more details that are in the write-up, but this is based on his experience on the Chrome loading team, as well as some experience at Cloudflare. Next slide. And actually, I should go back one, sorry. For people who haven't read it, the blog post that's linked to is quite a nice write-up of priorities. And it's well worth reading if it's only for educational purposes. So next slide. So what do we actually need here? Next slide. So based on what I can observe, separate research efforts, both Patrick Meenan and Robin Marks and others have kind of come to around the same conclusion of what we want, at least for standard web page loading. So the optimal ordering, according to Patrick, is serialize the CSS and blocking JavaScript. I'll just let you read it because probably it's faster. So here. Next slide. Sorry. This is for a web page. Yes, this is not for video and other things. No one's actually done video, like research on video, which is always kind of curious. I did ask Robin for follow-up on that, but I assume he's not got around to it yet. So this is Kazuo's comment, which is a much, maybe a more visual representation of largely the same text that was in Patrick's comment. And so there's a few ways of representing this, but I think we have a much better idea, at least for web page loading, like what we're trying to achieve. So one more slide. And from Robin and Mark's paper itself, some observations, and he compared, I think, 8 or 9 different schemes against one another. More sequential schemes generally outperform more round-robin-like schemes. So if in doubt, do FIFO. And it's perfectly possible to switch to a simplified prioritization framework while still fully supporting the web browser use case without losing performance. So next slide. Yeah, so what do we really need? Most things we want to be FIFO. Some things ideally should be round robin. So we want to try to make FIFO easier, and that's why we did the orphan placeholder proposal in the existing H3 model. Next slide. So H2 priorities can achieve optimal loading, but so why do we want to change this? So there are some pretty substantial issues, some of them technical and some of them non. Next slide. So I think we'd really like wide adoption. It depends on your view of adoption and HTTP2 priorities, but full adoption is something in the range of 25% according to one study. I think partial adoption is certainly a bit better, but it's certainly not ubiquitous on either the client or the server side. And most of the clients that you saw at the beginning, they started using priorities on a day that some web developer decided he had some good ideas, and then he did a test and maybe it was better in some circumstance, and then it hasn't been touched in 4 years, right? I mean, this is not being actively worked on and improved from what I can observe. So, I mean, I don't think we're seeing an increase in the H2 priority adoption at this stage, or dramatically changing usage patterns from what I can establish. So I have 2 minutes. That's awesome. Next slide. As Patrick Meehan pointed out in his blog post very nicely, it would be awesome to allow server input. Sometimes the server simply does no more than the browser, and the existing tree model is extremely difficult to achieve this. So as we already discussed, you have to put everything in a certain order, and you have to put everything on the header stream. Otherwise, you have the possibility of losing synchronization. If you try to achieve that with a backend and a client at the same time, it's essentially an intractable problem. It's impossible to know really what the tree should look like. Next slide. Firefox needs placeholders. Right now, they're not actually required. That's sort of a bummer for them. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. What if it doesn't work? Next slide. Okay. Let me stop here because I have 1 minute left. Next slide. Sorry. Next. There we go. Sorry. This is not. So my original thought was, it seems like we're basically narrowing down on some proposal that's some amount of number of buckets and a bit for concurrency as being perfectly sufficient for the web browsing use case and providing optimal performance. And we have some better ideas on how to use it. My original suggestion was that we try to move forward with that and try to move forward with that for both HTTP2 and for HTTP3. Subsequently, others have suggested they really don't want to go that way at this stage in the game, and that the optimal option is to remove priorities from the draft entirely. I am happy with that option. Martin Thompson has prepared a PR for that option. From a procedural perspective, I think that's a more expedient way forward because it does not block the standardization of HTTP3 on figuring out optimal priorities, which are really 2, I would say, orthogonal issues. I mean, I don't think there's a requirement that one be blocked on the other. And as we've already shown through the issues that I posted here, there are substantial issues with just kind of fixing H2 priorities and moving them onto H3 that are already creating substantial challenges. So.
All right, so I'm going to miraculously transform. You now see before you a quick working group chair. From that perspective, what we're looking for is input from this community about how HTTP3 should address priorities. One of the big concerns in that work is that the more delta we have from HTTP2 semantics in HTTP3, the more friction it could create for adoption of the new protocol. And so if you know, HTTP, this working group owns the semantics of this protocol. And so that's why we're here, is to have this discussion. So, right. We have 1 minute. And so there's a meeting at 8:30 on Wednesday in Van Horn. That's where we'd like to see this continue. And I think we can dedicate some time on Thursday to summarize what happens there. Is that the plan? Yes. So with the rest of the minute, go for it.
Roberto Payon, I'm going to try and go as fast as possible. So I want to say that it doesn't really matter what's spec'd. What matters is what implementations do. And from that perspective, H2 priorities, as cool as it seemed at the time, seems like it's a failure, right? So let's figure out what the next thing is and move on. So I would also warn people, however, a lack of priorities is really bad. We know that from what we did in Speedy initially in the very initial things. We have to have some priorities. We can't do it without it. And server priorities, I agree, is going to be more interesting than client in the end. Thank you.
And that's really the conundrum, right? So really quick, guys.
Yeah,
like 10
cut
seconds.
fastly. Even though we have a fully compliant prioritization implementation for both H2 and H3, we think I think that we should move to this.
Mike Bishop, Akamai, I want to point out that we ship server push without cache digests. We understand what happens when we ship half of a working feature. Multiplexing without priorities is half a working feature.
And with the wrong priorities to non-working features.
From Jabber, Robin Mark says, we have insight for video streaming, but not as detailed as web page loading.
Martin, last word for today, but then there's Thursday for everyone.
We need prioritization, but we don't need signaling for prioritization.
All right, we're adjourned. We'll see you all Thursday. Or the side meeting on Wednesday morning, bright and early.
Thank you, Dave.
There's a lot of HTTP in 2 hours. Given that this is my day job. You didn't want to talk about something else?